Worry rarely announces itself as unbelief. It usually feels responsible. It feels like thinking ahead, planning for what might happen, or carrying the concern for people that you love. But before long, concern can become a burden that God never assigned us to carry. Philippians 4:6 might be the most quoted verse in this letter of Philippians. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. That verse appears in a lot of places. Sympathy cards, wall art, sermons on stress management, and in almost every one of those contexts, something essential is often lost. Paul is not offering a coping mechanism. He's not telling us that prayer is a technique for reducing your cortisol levels or achieving some kind of calmer mental state. Paul's making a claim about what is true, about who God is, about what it means to bring our needs to Him, and about the kind of peace that God promises. The peace he describes in verse 7 surpasses all comprehension. It's not a vague calm. It is a guarded peace. This episode works through the sequence Paul gives in verses 4 through 9. Rejoicing, gentleness, prayer, and the governance of the mind. Taken together, they're not a list of spiritual disciplines. They are a portrait of what the inner life looks like in a person who's actually standing firm. Paul begins in verse 4 saying, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. The repetition is not accidental, it's intentional. Paul is not making a suggestion to us. Paul is issuing a command and doubling it as if he anticipates an objection. So he says rejoice, and he anticipates someone's going to say, oh, wait a minute, Paul. You remember what I'm dealing with. Remember my circumstances. But Paul's already made known to us his circumstances. He's in chains. He's facing a capital verdict, possibly. He's writing from house arrest. So the command to rejoice comes from that location, that situation, which means we can't dismiss it as the easy optimism of someone who is living comfortably but trying to tell those who are suffering how to deal. The qualifier that he offers is critical. Because when he tells us to rejoice, he doesn't just leave it at that. He says, rejoice in the Lord. Not in your health or your relationships, your finances, your country, your outcomes. In the Lord. Joy that's tethered to our circumstances rises and falls with our circumstances. But joy that's tethered to the Lord does not work that way. The Lord does not change. And that's the only kind of joy that can survive a command like this one. Rejoice always. Gordon Fee writes that joy lies at the heart of the Christian experience of the gospel. And he goes on to say it's the fruit of the Spirit in any truly Christian life, serving as primary evidence of the Spirit's presence. The command to rejoice is not a command to manufacture something. Paul's not telling us to pretend like everything's okay or to work up, find up here happy when you're not. The command is a command to live in the reality that the Holy Spirit of God produces. A reality that is grounded in what is true about God and His Christ, what is true about the future, not what is true about present circumstances. Paul goes on in verse 5 and gives us another exhortation or command. And he basically tells us to be notoriously gentle. He says, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. The word that he uses for gentle spirit is a word that in Greek is not easily translated into any one English word because it has a number of ideas that can be associated with it. William Hendrickson, the New Testament scholar, lists a dozen English candidates. Let me give you just a few of his suggestions. forbearance. Having a gentle spirit can indicate yieldedness, geniality, kindliness, sweet reasonableness, magnanimity. John Eadie, the Scotch theologian, describes this gentleness as a gentleness with a backbone, convictions held without being quarrelsome, leniency exercised with discernment. So all those kinds of ideas are perhaps included when Paul says, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. And notice again, known to who? Well, all men, or everybody. So not just the congregation, the church that's there, not just to your closest friends, your tribe of people that mostly agree with you, your people who view politics like you view them. No, all men. Everyone who encounters you, including the people you disagree with, should encounter this quality. You have a gentle spirit. It should be known. Let it be known to all men. A recognizable characteristic. So not just an occasional good day. Boyd Jones describes this person as having the capacity to differentiate between what is really of vital importance and what is not. To stand like a rock by the things that are vital and to be reasonable about the things that are not. That's been lost in so much of our society today. And Christians, we need to recapture that. The closing phrase of verse 5 is not incidental. Let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is near. The nearness of Christ is both the motivation to let your gentleness be known, and it's also the resource so that you can. The one who did not grasp equality with God as a thing to hold on to is coming. He's not far off. He is near. And because he is near, you don't have to defend yourself in every situation. Because he is near, you don't have to carry the future as though it rests on you. It doesn't. Then in verse 6, Paul writes, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. This command targets a sinful anxiety, the kind that treats God as if he were absent or unreliable or uncaring. This is not a command not to care about anything or anybody. That's not what he's saying. It's not a command to not plan for the future. Paul, in fact, uses the same root word in another place in Philippians to describe Timothy's legitimate concern for the Philippians' welfare. The distinction is not between caring and not caring. The distinction is between trusting God and not trusting God. Anxiety rarely remains contained. Anxiety about money can become hoarding. Anxiety about success can become irritability or even deviousness. Anxiety about relationships can make us controlling or withdrawn. Worry does not just trouble our minds. It often begins to govern our lives, and we live in light of the worry instead of in light of God. So Paul tells us to pray, to bring our supplications to God with thanksgiving. Supplication names the specific need. Here is the thing that's concerning me, God. And then thanksgiving sets it inside of a larger story. This is God who has already shown himself faithful. So I bring my concern, but I remember that there is a God who has met me so many times before, and he's always been faithful, and he will be faithful now. There's a hymn that we sing that contains this line: his love in times past forbids me to think he'll leave me at last in trouble to sink. The thanksgiving in prayer helps us to remember that, even as we bring our concerns to God. So the thanksgiving is not a formality. It's not something that you just have to say. So you lay all your concerns, your gripes, your grievances before God, and then you tack on thanks at the end. No, thanksgiving is woven into the asking itself all the way through, because the one you're asking is the one who's already proven himself trustworthy. So the whole posture of prayer, the act of bringing your need to God rather than carrying it yourself, is a declaration of what you actually believe about who is in control. And the result is described in verse 7. The peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The word translated guard is a military term. It speaks of a garrisoned peace. Soldiers, if you will, standing sentry over the inner life. Peace, God's peace will be like that, standing guard over you. It's not a peace that makes sense of the circumstances. It surpasses comprehension. It's inexplainable. You can't completely understand it, because it does not require the situation to be resolved. If the situation is resolved and peace results, you understand that, you comprehend that. But God gives peace in the midst of the unresolved situation, and that peace stands guard over the heart and mind. In verse 8, Paul says, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. The word finally does not introduce a new section. Here it closes one. Paul is summing up everything he's described about rejoicing and gentleness and prayer depends on what's going on in your thoughts, in your mind. You cannot sustain any of the things he's described if your mind is ungoverned, if it's allowed to run free to every fear, every doubt, if you dwell on the worst outcomes, if that's where you're constantly thinking, you will not heed his commands. The command that he gives here is to let your mind dwell. So not just a passing thought about, here's all my troubles, but God's good, God's faithful, but the troubles, no. Let your mind dwell here. It's a word that implies intentional, sustained pondering. I'm thinking about this. I'm bringing my mind back to these realities again and again. Paul's not telling us to retreat into pleasant thoughts and pretend like the trouble doesn't exist. But he is telling us to refuse the lies. Refuse the imagined futures, the what ifs. Have you ever lived there? What if this happens? Oh, but what if this happens? And what if that happens? And each one is worse than the one before, and none of them have happened. But we're living as if it already has. We have to refuse those things, refuse resentment, refuse corruptions that compete for control of your mind and your thoughts, and dwell deliberately on what is in alignment with the truth and goodness of God. Paul gives us 6 categories here, and they are comprehensive. He said the things that are true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, of good repute. And he qualified them all with the word whatever. Whatever is true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, of good repute. Not just the big things, not just the dramatic things, but really each moment and each choice should be brought to God and evaluated in light of these 6 categories. Is this true? Is this honorable? Is this right? Then verse 9 adds a complement. Think about those 6 categories, Paul says. And then he says in verse 9, the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things. So think about these things, these 6 categories. But then there are things that you've learned and received and heard and seen and in me, the example that you've seen, the things you've heard taught. Practice those things. Not enough to think about what's right, but not do it. Not enough to think about what's true, but then not act on it. So think, but move the thinking into the realm of practice. And notice that with the practice comes the promise in verse 9, the God of peace will be with you. Not just the peace of God that we saw in verse 7, that's there. The peace of God will guard your heart and your mind. But now added to that, Paul says the God of peace will be with you. So not just the peace that he gives, but the God of peace himself will come and be your companion. Paul does not tell anxious believers to pretend nothing's wrong. He tells them where to take what's wrong. What do you do with it? Well, you rejoice in the Lord. You be notorious for gentleness. Bring everything to God with thanksgiving. Refuse to let your mind run to places it shouldn't run, but bring it back again and again to dwell on what is true and lovely and right and of good repute. Practice what you've received. And Paul gives two promises. The peace of God will guard your heart and your mind, and the God of peace will be with you. The Christian answer to worry is not that you gain control. You're going to get your hands around this thing and you're going to fix it. That's not it. The Christian answer to worry is that you belong to the God who already has control. And he has you. One episode remains, and it's the capstone. A man in chains, thanking people for a gift and describing a contentment that he explicitly says he had to learn. The secret of it, it turns out, has been the subject of this entire series. Hope to see you then.